Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us for Mozilla's Pride Month Dialogues and Debates panel. I'm your moderator, Jay Baba Lota. I'm also the Vice President of Global Programs here at the Mozilla Foundation. Today's panel is titled Queerness is in Multitudes. We're going to explore how queerness and the internet intersect. More specifically, we'll unpack questions like, how does the queer community engage with a tech landscape that is often exclusive and even dangerous? What does it mean to queer this landscape and co-opt these systems? Is it possible to not co-opt them? And how has technology made a global LGBTQIA plus movement possible or work to our detriment? So small things, that a group of brilliant queers can certainly solve on the internet in 60 minutes. So joining me today are four very brilliant panelists, and I feel very honored to be in the room with y'all. Panelist Cassius Adair is an audio producer, writer, and researcher from Virginia. Beginning in fall 2022, he will be an assistant professor of media studies at the New School in New York City. Then we have panelist Ina Fried, the chief technology correspondent at Axios. She authors the daily Axios login newsletter and brings years of Silicon Valley experience to offer a smart take on tech. Welcome. Panelist Shakir Mohammed works on technical and socio-technical questions in machine learning research. Shakir is a principal scientist at DeepMind in London, an associate fellow at the Labour-Home Center for the Future of Intelligence, and an honorary professor of University College London. Welcome, Shakir. Panelist Xin Xin, they, them, is an interdisciplinary artist, designer, and organizer currently making socially engaged software that explores the possibilities of reshaping language and power relations. Sheen is the creator of TogetherNet and teaches at Parsons School of Design as an assistant professor of interaction and media design. Welcome. One last thing, we're taking questions for this panel in real time, so please tweet them at Mozilla Festival with the hashtag Dialogues and Debates, AND spelled out. So let's get started. All right, so as should happen in the month of June, let's start with a big paradox. The internet is where LGBTQI folks come to find community and to build movements, but the internet can also be a tool for the people who oppose us. You recently described the internet as a double-edged sword. What does it mean to you to build and create and mobilize within this paradox? And any question I ask, any panelist, please hop in. I'll direct it, perhaps, if you want to kick us off, and then also feel free to go wildly off the rails, and I'll bring us back if it feels like a thing to do. Otherwise, I'll leave us there. Ina?
Well, I mean, the internet has been just this incredible opportunity to start with the positive for the LGBTQ plus community. I mean, if you think about the amount of time that civil rights movements tend to take, it's accelerated the amount of time from the women's movement to the civil rights movement to the gay movement, to lesbian and bi movements, and then the trans movement, and more recently, non-binary and other identities. I think it's sped up in part because of our ability to gather online. I know for me personally, and I'm going to date myself here, I found out about transgender identity online. Now, at the time, 20 plus years ago, online meant news groups. So before the modern internet was really a thing, there was a thing called alt-transgender. But the important thing hasn't changed, which is the ability to gather with people who are dealing with the same issues but aren't physically proximate. And that's super powerful, whether it's, young trans people or parents of trans people being able to gather with other parents. So there's a lot of power there. On the flip side, it's not just about the fact, though this is important, that people who oppose LGBTQ rights are meeting online, and they certainly are. They're meeting in Facebook groups. They're planning, unfortunately, both political campaigns and strategizing, as well as physical violence. So those are obviously issues. But it's more than that, and we'll get into some of these other issues, but it's also the degree to which the technology and the internet can provide freedom. So for example, I'm excited about the idea of a metaverse where somebody can explore a gender or sexuality with fewer costs. I mean, that's, the fun of the internet is being able to be who you envision yourself or want to be and try on things. That's what's really cool. But I'm also concerned about a world that can limit LGBTQ identity, whether that's forms that don't provide enough room for our broad identities. So, you know, if you don't have they, them as an option, that's obviously a slight detriment, but it's way more, and we'll get into a bunch of this, but it's algorithms that codify bias. So those are some of the things that I'm really exploring, as well as kind of, you know, the metaverse. It could be this opportunity for freedom and exploration and safety. But if it's not done properly, you know, you face the same risks of harassment online, magnified by the fact that you're actually feeling it versus maybe typing it or seeing it in a web screen.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's also the way that we're like, there are uniquely queer ways to gather. There have been historically, and what it means to show up to a place and to know that you can find folks who you wouldn't be able to find otherwise. And I'm just curious if any of our other panelists want to pick up on that. Is there still a uniquely queer way to gather on the internet, or is it flattened it for us?
I mean, I think that one thing that I love about digital spaces is that they are very multifarious, and that some things that I hope younger people are doing is finding spaces that I don't know about. So for my younger siblings who are also queer and trans, like their private gaming Discord servers are like incredible trans spaces of connection and solidarity, and also like love relationships, sexual relationships, romantic relationships, like types of social dynamics that I actually think mimic some of those early internet sort of text-only dialogical spaces that you were referencing around like Usenet and early news groups. And in part, they work that way because they're not sort of visual, they're not real name spaces. They're spaces that are invitation only or somehow kept into a sort of more micro-public community. So I think that it isn't so much like, you know, is there a good, is trans Twitter good? Right? Or is trans Twitter more of a liability for us because our enemies can also see trans Twitter, which they definitely can, and it's definitely violent. But also that means that people are finding, I think, more insular and more private, more secretive spaces, and sometimes spaces that are not designated like this is the trans server, but like, hey, this is Overwatch. It just happens to be that like so many people who play Overwatch are non-binary, right? So like this is just where we're hanging out now. And I think that's good. I think that actually helps protect us in a lot of ways and helps people find themselves in unexpected spaces.
I really like the playfulness alongside of all of the other ways. I mean, it's sort of this it's so many locations at once. And certainly like, you know, you touched on this, right? But okay, it's not this didactic, the internet is either for or against us, right? But, and it's not just the folks that use it, but what about the code and the data and the systems themselves, right? Because we know from many other communities of which we're either a part or in solidarity with, right? If the right folks aren't at the table and this technology is being made, bias is inevitable. There's no utopian by virtue of it being technology that somehow we've undone every systemic disparity that exists in the analog world, and if not to a greater extent, because it's invisible to folks who are feeling the harm of that. So how do we get the right folks at the table? What choices can we make once we're actually there? Shakir, do you want to kick us off with a response?
Thanks, Bob, and just thanks for having me. And the panel is, we're going to have so much fun. I suppose I maybe want to just pick up from the previous question, is that when we look at the kind of living reality of the internet, then there's just so many ways of harm that can be created. And I think Ina did such a good job of just setting us up that there has been good. But I think maybe the thing that concerns us is that the internet, but any technology, there's always some group of people who are being harmed, and that harm is coming in. Particularly today, we are concerned with the subset of our queer community, but I think that is the lesson that we all have for so many other different kinds of groups who live at the margins, who are vulnerable in certain kinds of ways. And, you know, we see that example of unique queer ways of coming together, which is an example of Grindr, for example. And I think as Cassius is saying, at the same time, there are governments in certain parts of the world that will go on to Grindr and then use that as a way of exposing people, blackmailing people. And so you can see again that kind of double-edged sword. But I don't know that I want us to use the language of double-edged sword, actually. This is the living reality of the internet, of the technologies that we are building and developing. And I think what we need to do is just remember there are ways of being actively harmful, in the case of Grindr, for example. But then there are also systematic ways of being harmful. And so the example of bias of language, for example, if homophobic language is being used over the internet and they enter into chatbots, for example, then that creates a kind of systematic and systemic harm that's much more difficult to address. So then part of the solution, I suppose, to that problem is to bring more diverse communities of people into the kind of table. And that starts with ourselves and starts with the power of creating new and unique queer spaces where queer joy lives in all its varieties and variabilities, because we get to then extend the tools of the tricks of the trade that we have to other kinds of people. So I suppose that's one place. I suppose we also need to almost critique the idea of this single table. Part of the problem is the centralization of power into singular pieces of technology. So what we actually want to do is break them in many different ways so that we don't have this kind of centralization of power, which then in some senses can be very unjust in that sense. And then there's a kind of queer justice that needs to be addressed through centralization of power in that way. I suppose then the final tool for all of us is that, for any of us, wherever we came from in the world, I'm from South Africa, so but I'm living in London today. I literally came from the other part of the world that I came from. And it's sure we can come into our space of technology, our companies, but once we enter our companies, we change ourselves. We are different. So that cannot be a systematic long-term solution for all the problems of bias and systemic issues that are in the world. So I think what we need to do ourselves is hold ourselves accountable to bring more spaces of participation into the kinds of technologies we are building, the way we are designing. There's a lot that can be said there, but I think, a few others will have to add on that. So I'm just going to end there and thanks.
We could swim in there for a really long time. Shin, were you going to say something?
Yes, I just want to echo and say, plus 1,000 to what has just been described. I think that the more I dive into the realm of tool making and software creation, the more I think about, the kind of idea of a table surrounded by people who are right? And I think oftentimes coming from a kind of standpoint and perspective of an anarcho-feminist who is queer, I think what I see is this I continuously am curious and interested in asking the question of who is being left out and for what reason are they being left out, right? And so I for me, when it comes to like returning to thinking about the table, my question comes down to, wait, so whose responsibility is it to co-create, to make this world more inhabitable for queer folks, but also to allow the openness to co-create with people who might not be tech savvy, people who might not understand the ins and outs of how algorithms are biased and have like the kind of know-how or knowledge to tap into those kind of readings. And for me, so it kind of like come back to how can we make these types of writing, this kind of language, by language are including documentation of software. How do we make it radically accessible? How do we like find, can we actually place these responsibilities, or maybe it's a kind of like complete changing of ways of thinking about software writing and thinking about documentation so that, it can be accessible to a point where someone who doesn't read code or cannot doesn't have like a entry point or even necessarily a deep interest in like understanding what the algorithm is doing to still have a say, on what happens to the tools that they're using.
And maybe, Bob, while we're kind of at the early framing of our discussion, to complicate things in two other ways, two notions that are widely used that I'd like us to add some nuance and complexity to. One, this idea of like who's at the table, whether it's in the product or in the design of the product. Not everyone sits at that table equally and equitably. And the idea that, it's not enough to just have one representative of an underrepresented community. Like, who are they? Do they have equal power in the room when decisions are being made? Or if you think about Twitter, there's a lot of debate right now about free speech and what does it mean? Like, you know, right now, if you come from a group of people, and that's women, people of color, trans people, and other groups, you might have equal say in one sense, but if you know you're going to get harassed and your mentions are going to become trash, like there's a huge cost. So your seat is more perilous. Maybe it's a seat with spikes on the chair. And then the second notion I wanted to also throw out is this idea. I'd really love to see this notion thrown in the trash of technology as neutral, as a good thing. So I do believe technology is neutral. But to me, that gets totally misinterpreted. To me, that means technology is tremendously powerful. It can do great good and it can do great harm. And it is incumbent upon the people wielding these incredibly powerful tools to recognize that potential for harm at the onset and design around minimizing harm. And I've covered Silicon Valley for decades, and I still don't feel that responsibility is really held tightly. There are definitely people who see it, who advocate for it, some of whom are in this chat, who are listening to this chat, but we need to do a much better job of really identifying the harms early on, and not just saying, well, you know, every tool can be used for good or bad and throwing our hands up, which I think has been the historical way that technology's neutrality has been dealt with.
Yeah, I think we need.
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, like, I think about these things from a historical perspective, and I just wanted to add on one bit to that before I studied digital history, I studied cars, and the journey from cars being like just this weird new machine that, you know, we can use to get people from one place to another faster, to, oh no, suddenly there's a huge death rate of these murder vehicles because we have no way to regulate what it takes to drive them. What type of physical and mental capacities do you use to drive them? And the question around regulation was also a question about freedom and identity, because as soon as we started saying, oh, wait, these are really dangerous, the next step after that was saying, oh, well, maybe only certain types of people should be allowed to have them. Maybe only white men should be allowed to drive cars. And maybe women are just too feeble or too absent-minded to drive. And so there's this question about what do we do when we introduce a dangerous new technology? And then how do we make the regulatory systems not also a site of harm? And we see this in the early 20th century, people trying to work this out. We have this new murder weapon, basically, of an automobile, and we have crowded cities that are changing demographically. We have new social and gender and racial relations happening. Can we use the automobile as an excuse to just do more violence, to use regulatory systems to actually exclude people more by saying you're not good enough to drive or you're going to be more harmful? Is no regulation actually better than that? Well, definitely it's not, because they didn't invent seatbelts, right? It was like super dangerous. So we have actually these historical analogs of trying to solve this problem. And it takes these sort of like multiple decades of coalitional structures of people saying, not just that we need to regulate this dangerous technology, but we need to regulate it in a way that doesn't just reinscribe racial and gender harm. And I don't think we're actually even at step one of that conversation, which is to say, maybe this is dangerous. I don't think we're in agreement there. So I think we've got like a lot of work to do to even look to the past to figure out what are just ways to enact safety controls on these dangerous systems.
Okay, I want to acknowledge the like thousands of moments of science that just got dropped amongst all of you. I'm going to reflect some of those points back because we've put really a range of ingredients on the table, right? We started with queer joy, with this idea of authenticity around a queer dispersion and like a nod to diaspora there, right? The idea of like, how can we have circles of folks who are reaching beyond, ironically, the binary, right? Like beyond code, beyond actually even anything that's getting qualified or quantified as technology, and saying there are voices and people impacted, and how are we reaching into those circles? Also, there was about like inherently this consolidation of power and the like the tension between tools and product, right? And then the technology that we're embedding in our lives, like, can we own that differently? Can it get designed differently? Does it have to get codified in this a way then to be regulated? And then especially when many of us already have lives and bodies and histories that where regulation has yet to be a good thing, and that's always been actually against our very existence. So how do we even advocate for, like, what does advocacy look like in that way? What does designing look like in that way? And then there's also a play, like that notion of playfulness and beauty, by virtue of trying ourselves on in these different capacities and ways, and the story that tells, right? Does it redefine queerness in that way? Can we redefine the space? And then how do we learn from history? And what does that mean for us to bring it forward? So I just want to point out that we could clearly talk for 47 hours about everything that just got said in that go round, and I want to acknowledge that. And but I'm curious about that design element, and how we can design with intent, right? Is there a design that actually upends? Do we have to be at that table, capital T table? Can we just say, can we do away with that from jump? Is that an inevitability? Is it okay, we need some folks playing the inside and the outside game? What does that look like? What do interventions look like? Do we need to change what we understand design even to be? Sheena, I'm curious where you'd come in on that.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So I think, so much of it, the idea of subversion and redesign, a problematic system, for me is by directly going against the notion of move fast and break things, right? Like this exact idea of moving fast, breaking things, and creating intervention that that's the orbit around the speed of that system. For me, I think there's a lot of usefulness to it, but it's not exactly where I'm at right now, because what I am interested in imagining right now is what does it mean to move at the speed of trust, a la Ira Marie Brown, with people that we're designing for. And moving at the speed of trust means we're moving extremely slow. It means dedicating enormous amount of resource and energy that is required in a research and development phase, and ultimately possibly working with a smaller group of people and designing for them, which a lot of that come from the idea of participatory design, where designers imagined stakeholders as being people who are funders, designers, as well as users, being there at the table from the very start. Right. And so I think that I think that when sometimes the question of how do we redesign or subvert a system that is so large, to a point that, I think one of the things that I talked about with some of my friends who are interested in this stuff is that we have figure out a way to create these large scale global system, the internet platforms and such, but we have not figured out how to scale up consent, right? So we might know how to get people to reach certain kind of consensus, if I have 200 people, 1,000 people, 2,000 people, but when we get to that point, we lose a lot of nuance. We are neglecting a lot of needs and the specificity of different type of queerness. And I'm interested in thinking about queerness through an intersectional lens when we're trying to institutionalize it in some ways, right? And so a lot of that nuance gets lost, and it becomes a problem that I find overly consuming, and I wonder what it means to start small and possibly using smaller action and smaller ways of creating communities, and maybe forking and replicating this way of working as a way to subvert, as a way to, not just subvert, because I also don't like spending too much time thinking about people who are anti-queer. So it's also, a way to recenter queer joy, right? A way to recenter what it is that we need here within this community that we have.
That's gorgeous. Let's get into that. How can we scale from by centering queer joy? What does that look like to you? I'm so happy for any circle that brings Adrienne into it. So let's give Adrienne Marie Brown her props around moving at the speed of trust. So let's break that down. Let's go a little bit slower. Does local or home or right? What does scale, not scale, look like in a way that's like queer and viable and joyful? Shakir, what you got?
One of the things that I think is so powerful for us is this idea of queering. And when we enter space, we queer those spaces. And it's a very simple thing. It's just for a brief moment to think that the thing that we think it is, or what we see, may be the opposite of what it appears to be. And if we take that simple idea of querying technology, querying machine learning, querying AI into the spaces that we work, then that is almost the most fundamental thing we can do, because that, I think, is how we can then take our queer joy into those spaces. Other people can then pick them up, and we can really build on movements of solidarity beyond just queerness, but really those kind of assemblages of solidarity in real ways. So I would say that on this particular question, there's an idea of building the technologies of resistance that I always love going back to, which says that you can take a piece of technology and repurpose it. Again, it's a query in the opposite way that it was meant to be used, and then reshape it in some way. The internet in some way was queered and reshaped as the technology of resistance for so many movements across the world. So I think as designers, we can center our own thinking in those kind of ways to not, as Ina said, fall into the trap of technological neutrality that makes us think that things, we just give up responsibility, but rather the responsibility is more that we can shift people to think outside of their usual spaces, and then to, try and build technologies with the optionality that they are different. But ultimately, we are also talking about systematic issues. And I'm going to go again and again, what we need to do is take this kind of ecosystem view on change, that we can do things as individuals. I'm really a strong fan of creating and sustaining grassroots organizations and their power to reshape a narrative, to take control, to create new kinds of tables. And then, we need to do our work of advocacy and supporting our work to do change. So I really think, as computer scientists, as coders, as technologists, we love the idea of a stack. And so I always think about, well, what does that kind of socio-technical stack of change look like? What does that ethical stack of change look like? What does the queer stack of change in some place look like? And I think that's another really powerful set of things that we can actually do together.
Yeah, if I can echo something that Shakir was saying, like in terms of, I think there is huge responsibility on the people who design technology, who put it into the world. And I do think we need to hold them accountable. But I love this idea also of taking and reclaiming some of the tools that have been used against us. And we need to do that. Like, we need to both advocate for the major online spaces to be safer than they are. We need them to be. People are being harmed. And at the same time, it's an easier lift to say, I'm going to counter program. I'm going to use the tools that are out there, whether it's, some folks were talking about the Discord servers for gaming that, aren't necessarily about queer, but that doesn't mean they can't be massively queer spaces, and meet people where they're at. I think the idea of visibility is interwoven into a lot of this, that part of the way we queer the internet is by being visible. Is by bringing our presence to the Discord server, to our work meetings as we're planning projects, to our social spaces. And I've certainly felt over the last few years so much more need to be more visible, more vocal. I've been out as trans for 20 plus years. And for a lot of that, I really just relished being visibly and audibly trans while not really talking about it a lot. But at a time when our identities are so under attack and people would take rights away from the most marginalized groups, I spend every moment thinking, how can I push myself to have more impact? How can I push the organizations that I'm a part of? As a journalist, how can I push Axios to do its best journalism? How can I encourage my peers to do their best work? And to me, it is such a, 5-alarm fire for democracy, for individuals, for marginalized groups, that we got to be doing both.
I mean, I think you bring up a really good point too about the range of experience that's happening in the space that we're sort of overarching, like saying the internet, and that there are those of us participating in these spaces with very different levels of privilege and freedoms, and with really different experiences with in relation to others, right? So it might be that we're in a place where there is an open internet. We're in a place where there are internet shutdowns. We're in a place that's heavily surveyed, right? A dear friend and colleague tweeted this morning, "Happy Pride" from the government of Kuwait, who launched a campaign named Participate in Censorship, which is specifically asking people to report LGBTQ symbols and representation. But it speaks to a subversion, right? So that there's the distinction between a banned LGBTQ flag and a rainbow is that the flag has 6 colors while the rainbow has 7. And so they're asking folks to identify queer symbols and reporting them, right? So it's just a whole range of experiences that are happening. And yet we have a shared experience of having some touchstone in there. And so visibility is in incredible ranges of degrees, and all of it is a risk, right? Like, and so I think that that's also a super, super important thing for us to hold. I'm curious about, but one other thing that you just said is, what does it mean to change over time? And also, what does reclamation look like, right? Even us using the word queer is a reclamation unto itself. And then what does it mean for us to reclaim space? And so over the course of the 20 years that you were just talking about, right, your own visibility or decisions around it change. And what does it mean in this space if we are slowing, to your point earlier, if we're slowing things down, if we're thinking at a different scale, what does it look like? How are we also projecting a future? Like, Cassius, you brought up the past, and I'm curious, what it means for you to dig into the past to look for the future.
Yeah, I'm happy to start there. I mean, I can take it in another direction too, because the more
go wherever you'd like to go.
Sure. I mean, the more I think about the sort of like, I was using a description of an example about the automobile and sort of 100-year-old arc of the automobile, right? And cars are still dangerous, and and also people still get pulled over for driving while Black, right? We have not solved the racial, regulatory, violent problem of the automobile. And also, the next 100 years of the automobile cannot exist because we do not have 100 years left of carbon to continue to have the type of automobile-based infrastructure that we have. And so if I continue my metaphor from, automobilic technology or transportation technology to digital technology, we also don't have 20 more years of the same internet, just from an ecological basis. And, I'm not an ecologist. I can't tell you the numbers on that. I know more of the history than I do about the future, but I know just looking at projections, we cannot sustain the number of servers that we have at the rate that those servers are processing. We are inventing new technologies that will inevitably degrade the technological communications infrastructure that we have at present that we're coming to rely on. So as we're talking about reclamation, we cannot actually be taking over these extant technologies because these extant technologies have a biological end date. If we just think about the planetary scope, and I hate to be that person who's like, but climate change, because it kind of ends a lot of conversations, but I hope that it also starts one, because I think that there are ways to not only build social infrastructures that are more sustainable, as I think that Shen was suggesting, but also we have to build digital or technological or communications infrastructure that might reintegrate some analog methods, right? Some sort of low carbon methods of technological communication, because otherwise I don't think it's going to do us any good to like, take over the discourse on Twitter while also like we can't sustain the like literal amount of energy that produces. So I don't know, I'm just like, how do we think both, Lana, sort of like the politics of now, meaning we are under attack with these digital infrastructures right now, and also the politics of 20 years, that fight can't happen on Twitter. That fight will also be happening at the literal level of resources. So how do we figure out a way to like re-leverage these digital fights into fights about our material survival?
And if I can add just to that, I think, so sometimes I think about climate change does bring things down, but for us today, that queerness of multitudes, actually climate change is a great thing for us, because one of the key lessons we learn from climate change is that certain challenges are really multi-generational. And I think the challenges that we all know of homophobia, of representation of LGBTQ people is a multi-generational challenge. And so we can think along these kind of multiple time frames of what it means to create consistency of community, to think about, as you said, for people who were born in the 80s or came out in the 80s, the queerness is still a jarring word for them, but we still have to work together in kind of solidarity in those kind of ways. But I wondered if we could invite maybe Ina to say a little bit more, because as you were speaking, I was wondering about the burden of representation that we feel. I think when we talk about the multitudes of queerness, this is something that really does take a burden on every single person who is an individual in their corporations, who has to always be the first one to ask, or always the first one to be making the same noise, to say, why do I have to always ask again for this certain kind of representation? And that really is a kind of burden on our psychology. It then affects our ability to shape and support our other colleagues in those ways. It affects our ability to work with the grassroots community. I don't know that I have insights. I wanted just to open that up. I don't want to deviate us for too much, but I think the challenges of queering a kind of technology systematically is, again, we need to confront the kind of burden that's put so unequally, particularly on queer people and any kind of group that lives at the margin. So anyway, I wanted to, sorry, Bob, to have taken over your.
No, never apologize for that. Yeah, trust.
I mean, I think, Shakir, I think it's a good point, and I think it is the reason why representation and diversity are so much more than tokenism. And if you think about the burden, if you have one person from each underrepresented group, it's intuitively obvious that that's burdensome, but it's really made so much more clear when you experience the joy, because I do want to hold joy of being in a truly diverse space. Two quick examples. We had this conversation in Davos, one of the least equitable and represented places I know, at the World Economic Forum, but we were having a dinner on the digital divide that Axios was doing, and there were 5 or 6 members of the Hispanic delegation that were at the table. And it was so beautiful to get to experience each of their fullness, because they weren't the one person having to bring up the fact that language is a barrier or, this issue. They could bring their full selves. And I've also gotten to work. Axios has transformed itself from its early days. Our founders are great, but they're 3 cis white straight men, and really become a diverse place to work. And the power of having other trans people in the newsroom. I've never had another trans colleague in a newsroom, and it's so powerful. And we're not perfect. I'm our tech writer, and I spend a lot of time, I would say way too much time, trying to improve our LGBTQ coverage, because I am the most prominent trans and queer person in the newsroom. But I do think that notion of representation going beyond one of each in the room is super important. And I also want to touch on the point you brought up about burdens. And I do think it is a burden in some ways, but I'm so thankful for it. And again, I have more energy sometimes to bring to the table, and I want to use that. I think about the burden it is to be young and trans and having your identity debated every day in the news, and that isn't something I had to deal with. And I do have a voice and a platform, and I do feel like it's exhausting, but I think it's more exhausting for people that don't have that power and that opportunity. And if it's a burden, it's a burden I'd gladly accept. And, again, should the burden be on the few that have more power? No, obviously it should be on all of us to, it's my responsibility as much as it is a person of color to advocate for things that matter to Black and brown people, to recognize things. The ideal world would have each of us taking responsibility for educating ourselves. That's unfortunately not the world we live in. But I do think, and I don't want to devolve us into a conversation of like energizing ourselves and, what do you do to take care of yourself? It is a mix. Like there are days I have more to give and days I have way less. And I do think, the realities of 2022 do mandate, sometimes you can be there and be all things. And sometimes, you've just got to figure out, how to survive that day.
Shin, you purposefully identified your intersectionality, feminism, and a desire to reach into analog communities. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and like why that's important. And one thing that came up for me certainly while Ina was speaking is insofar as anybody's being considered a representative, what's considered the norm isn't shifting, right? Like it's just you're repping in a space and normalcy or the norm is still standing firmly in place. And that's a power conversation. So I wondered if you could speak a little bit more, Shin, to what those things mean and how they can impact how we're even making sense of technology.
Yeah, definitely. And so I think the importance of thinking about intersectionality when it comes to building a tool or changing a tool, updating a tool that is meant to be widely used and adapted has a lot to do with, it's almost like a kind of like dialectical process, right? In the sense of when we focus on queer issues, what kind of queer body is it? Are we leaving out rural queers? There's like this like urban and rural queer kind of dynamic, especially when it comes to tech as well, right? And what does it mean to think of one, someone with a certain sexual orientation and gender, while like also holding space for issues of class and issues of race, ethnicity, etc. And so I think that intersectionality is a very helpful, probably think about it as kind of like a matrix. It's a very helpful matrix to kind of like lay down throughout the design and research process, and like really kind of inviting people who can speak from those different kind of positions to contribute and consider what it means to hold all of those different types of struggle in the same space, and how tool might evolve or change based on those type of nuances. I also, at the same time, I think the thing what Ina had described was like it's like actually for me this is like the exact dilemma for me, where representation is so crucial, but sometimes I also feel that what the part of representation that become widespread is the part that is more legible. And so I think about the problem of legibility, of like what part of queerness is more legible, more consumable, more understandable, by people who are not, don't identify as such, and how what part of it is invisible, right, or unspeakable because it's simply too different from the historically white capitalist mainstream culture to be understandable. And so I think simultaneously I'm also thinking about like what is sacred, right? Like, is there anything about queer relationship and queer knowledge embodiment that is meant to be private, right? So I think that for me in some way like cycle back to what Cassius was saying about the inevitable climate crisis and ecological collapse to come, right? Because like there's something about that and the thinking of returning back to analog. For me, pair up really finely with the dialogue around data privacy, like that I've had, for the last decade, relating to, what kind of information, what kind of communication should we be putting online? What kind of communication should we be putting on Twitter or, Facebook or whatnot? And what kind of communication is meant to happen over, signal or text message or in person, right? And what does this kind of levels of like analog to digital distribution tactics, how does that map onto people who are experiencing queerness in various different forms, or experience oppression of queerness really in various different forms. So I think that for me is, it's obviously a really big question, but I think I tend to want to think about, just the kind of like spectrum of visibility, invisibility, whether that invisibility is, whether that is desirable, or whether that is problematic, and how do we change that? How do we bring the illegible into the legible more? But then also sometimes how does it kind of get flattened, right? once it becomes more legible or understandable.
How are we not reifying some very mundane greatest common denominator in an effort to use language that's already in front of us? Yeah, I think that idea of legibility is super important. All right, you asked enough questions for another 30 panels. Let's get into some of them. I really, what do these ideas of the sacred, of queer sacred space, that spectrum of possibility, how does our notions of that and maybe ancestral technologies, analog technologies, present tense technologies, in the hybrid of that, how can we queerify this in a way that helps us, like, is it an ecological collapse, or is it a capitalist collapse that have created systems that literally don't work for a universe, right? So those are really big questions, but I'm curious what any of it sparks in any of y'all. And I saw you note-taking, Cassius. So.
Well, I guess that part of what I'm thinking around this is just my experience of living in Minneapolis for the last couple of years. And during the uprisings against the police in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, digital security was one of the things that activists were teaching each other very quickly. And especially younger activists, a lot of those movements were led by people in their really teens and 20s. There are high school kids out there and high school students who have never communicated with their peers in a sustained way without digital interfaces, right? And then they were saying, oh, wait, we can't use like Instagram to organize this action because the police are watching this. There are police helicopters in the sky, and there are also police surveying what is happening digitally. And it felt like, we were under curfew. It felt like a moment of real capture of so many layers of infrastructure. And then you watched people start to teach each other how to meet up in public, and spaces that had been burnt down as part of those uprisings became community gathering points for in-person human-to-human dialogue. And I don't think of that as, I don't have a utopian vision of that, but it was a moment where I was taught by people much younger than me that there is a possibility of transition towards person-to-person relation building and community networking that can be led by people who are not thinking back, oh, what was it like in the 90s where I had to call my friend's house and talk to their mother before I could talk to my friend. They're thinking, oh, what if we just do our group chat, but in person? And it kind of just works. Like, it's like these surprising kind of like blending of analog relationships and the type of collectivity that digital technologies support really worked, at least for a brief moment. And I don't know, it was just something that I keep coming back to when I'm theorizing the digital, is in the moments where we needed to pivot away from it for safety and security and keeping our communities together, people were able to do that. And it was very powerful to witness.
Which is certainly not unique to Black communities or unique to queer communities, but it is inherently a core part of queer communities and a core part of Black and Brown communities. And so, I mean, I think that that's a critical, and also your point about moments, like maybe it happens in moments. It needn't be this continuous 24/7, 365. Like, what does it mean for us to band these moments together? And then forgive me, I can't remember who said this earlier around queer knowledge, right? Like, does that actually become the knowledge, and does that span time and generations, and how do we, maybe those are the baby steps into the future in a way that's viable and actually holds our actual lives, right? Because to your point, that's a moment that's happening on the back end of emblematic murder, right? So what does it mean to actually, what would it mean to be emblematic of actually lives and livelihood and thriving? Yeah. Shakir, what you thinking about?
I was just thinking of sort of how we bring all of these together and sort of how I take some of the lessons that we're talking about of generational knowledge. I just love the idea of the sacred versus the knowledge that we share as well, and bring them together. And I always am just thinking back to the space of AI and back to machine learning, where data is now taking over so much of the world that we do. And, you know, back to our very first question, that kind of pros and cons, data can at the same time is the receipts we are asked to bring. When you're asked for representation, why should we do these certain interventions for queer communities? Then data is our power to be able to do that. Yet at the same time, data is the thing that is used simultaneously to oppress. To say, well, it's not really a priority, or actually I can identify these individuals or break their transparency or abuse their trust or avoid their kind of consent. And so I was just trying to reflect on sort of all of that together. And I just think there's that's sort of maybe where the biggest challenge for us as a researcher, for example, as a scientist, of where we are producing knowledge, is sort of really confronting and sort of what do we do within that in a more, again, systematic as individuals, and then also systematically. So yeah, that was sort of what was just on my head as Cassius was just speaking. And I also just love the story of the car. I'll be remembering that one. I usually use the story of the bicycle, though. I'm sure Cassius knows the story of the bicycle. But the bicycle is equally such an amazing tool that actually women's fashion entirely got reshaped because of the bicycle. It's not practical for women in Victorian times to just be on the bicycle. And so again, there's this kind of idea that technology does change society, but society also changes technology. And I think, you know, that's maybe the thing that's always there, is that, you know, a part of our conversation is that we sometimes get caught up in this determinism idea. It's going to happen, it's going to change, it's going to move forward. Yet it doesn't just move forward. We are there. If we don't do that work, then it doesn't happen. If we don't put the money in there, it doesn't get developed. If we don't advocate for certain change or safety or accountability or auditing or inspection or documentation, then things don't happen. So anyway, I don't know where that came from. I'm just going to end there.
Ina, what do you think about that? What does that bring up for you?
You know, I mean, there's been so much. I mean, my mind is flowing. You know, I think it all comes back to me of all this stuff. You know, our modern world, all technology has really done is really increase the impact of what we as individuals can do, who we can touch, and you know, it's the incredible power of our words. We've talked a lot about the technology. But you know, the technology has also allowed our words to travel so fast, so far. A simple word of hate travels and gets spread and shares and is insidious. And a word of love and encouragement can also have that same impact. You know, I didn't want to divert us, but you know, I launched this project, Letters for Trans Kids, in part because I saw the hate spreading so fast. And I was like, I can't stop the laws. I can't change the societal discourse in one step, but what I can do is counter it. What I can do is say, I can't allow this next generation who's bravely coming out at incredibly young ages to feel like the whole world hates them. Like, that's the world we came out to avoid. And we risk going back there if we don't use the power of our voices to send love as loudly as people are sending hate. And so, it's Pride Month, and I've been really struggling with the fact that, the world is harder. The world is less safe in a lot of ways, even as more and more of us are out. And that's a scary combination. And just, I encourage each of us as we, go through June and beyond, like, how can we most use our power, our voices, to spread some of that love, and just having faith that it will have an impact, that it matters, is so important to me.
Ina, it's hardly a diversion. Can you just tell us how folks can be involved with that effort?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's super simple. Basically, it's a social media campaign. The idea being there's so much hate out there, like just sending trans kids some love. You can post a handwritten letter with a photo of a letter, a short video, a typed tweet, whatever, on any social media. Use the hashtag letters for trans kids with the number 4. So letters, the number 4 trans kids, any social media. And, there's no rules, just sending love and having it be visible.
That's beautiful. Okay, we'll also tweet that, but thank you for doing that. And as a reminder, we're also taking questions. So please tweet them at us at Mozilla Festival with the hashtag dialogues and debates, or you can put them in the chat of YouTube if that's where you're watching. Can we talk a little bit about the future in advocacy? We have a few minutes left. So are there acts of resistance in the spirit of what Ina just shared that have moved you over time? Or is there an act of resistance that you imagine and you wish would happen? I'd be curious to know whether they've been overtly queer or not, but it would be beautiful to bring that to the room, to be thoughtful about. There's so much creativity, and when we're really thinking about resistance and love, I like to link those two things together.
Sorry, was that for me or someone in particular?
No, for everyone. If anyone,
Yeah.
if there's a certain like at any point in your relationship to the internet or technology, like a particular act of resistance that has moved you, or if there's one that you're longing for, I'd be really curious to know what it might be.
I'll just add maybe 2 different things. I think I've said them both already. One of them, the queering of our technological spaces is still so important. Again, if I come back as the role of a researcher or as a computer scientist, then we need to keep asking why it is we are working on the things that we are working on. Whose problem are we actually working on? Who has the power to create those kind of questions? And I think that's a really kind of powerful tool, both of our own resistance, but it also can spread that kind of resistance to other people. And in that way, we can actually also take the opportunity to spread joy or a different way of building the kind of world that we want to see by challenging and putting forward other kinds of questions. I'll say that one is vital. The other one is that each of us must continue to support grassroots movements, build new kinds of grassroots movements, because the power of change always comes at the bottom. No act of resistance throughout history has ever come from the powerful deciding that it was time to give up. The colonial empire did not decide to give freedom and democracy to the oppressed, but it actually became because of those acts of resistance and those sources of knowledge that were in those questions. So what each of us can do is continue to build, and then in that way, again, we don't become individuals, we then become part of a broader community, and those kind of communities do have power, they do have change, and they're both acts of love and acts of resistance in one kind of way. Together, just to come back to your theme, and that's sort of my 2 maybe end final thoughts.
Beautiful. Resistance, love, Shin, what do you have for us?
I think I continue to go back to thinking about queer archives, because I think it is from queer archive, which, on my end, I mostly absorb them through analog forms or, scanned pages onto the computer. And I think I often think about what it means to contribute or weave together queer archives that are existing right now, and what does it mean to become a queer elder for someone who is much younger, right? And I think for me that's when I start thinking about this in a kind of cross multi-generational way, the question of where do we store this archive? Where does the data live? Is it being stored in a way that is actually honoring this archive, honoring what we want to happen to this archive is becomes incredibly crucial. So I don't have all the answers yet, but I think those are, that is the goal, a liberatory queer archive that is created and maintained and viewed for queer people.
Thank you. Cassius.
One thing that I love is that a lot of the people who are leaving or who are leading labor movements within tech companies right now are queer and trans. And they're not necessarily organizing themselves as we're the queer and trans union thugs, right? They're just like, hey, we're oppressed people. We see how our benefits being, cut actually affects us in this urgent way. And it is just so cool because historically, labor movements and queer communities have had an interesting and not always positive relationship. But in the contemporary labor movement, I see like trans women walking off the job and just like it kicks ass. Like I don't have another like fancy academic way to say it. I just think it kicks ass and I'm excited about it. And I want to see like more recognition that trans people are not like your diversity tokens for your like new like rainbow ERG, but actually that have really smart, astute analysis and we know what side our bread is buttered on, and like we are in coalition with marginalized people. We're not special, like, we're not special, cool, like consumable nerds, although a lot of us are like weirdly good at math, but not me, but many of us, but like it does rule that like that we're fighting back and using our identities as part of, but not the whole of that resistance. So that's one thing that's been really like sparking hope for me recently.
Thank you so much. We're actually at time, but does anybody have any last thing that they want to add? No? Thank you so much for joining us. This is such a beautiful panel. I could literally talk to all of you for hours and hours, and I hope we get to chew food and drink things together at some point in the not so distant future. And I'll extend that out to everyone watching. Thank you so much. Please do keep an eye on @Mozilla Festival on Twitter, where we announce future dialogues and debates, panels, and other great things happening at MozFest. And then just gratitude for our production team at Mozilla. And please, everyone, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and happy Pride.